Hello and greetings. We're going to be reading from The Little People by Neil Phillip, The World of the Fairies. The world of the fairies has long been believed to overlap our world in some mysterious way. Time is not the same in the fairy world, and a night spent at fairy revels may be a year in human terms. Though we dwell on the same earth, we do not live in the same physical world. What looks like a grass-covered hill to us may be a palace of the fairies. Fairies, it is said, can cast a glamour over humans, making us see things that are not truly there. A glamour is a spell or enchantment, even in the world's modern use. When we say that someone is glamorous, we suggest that there is something not quite real about his or her beauty, but we are magnetically attracted to it, and the same is true of the beauty of the fairy world. When human beings get a glimpse of the fairies, they are often left hungering to know more. To one who has been touched by fairy glamour, our everyday world seems dull. Our food has no savor, our laughter rings hollow. It is the fairy world, the perilous realm for which the person longs. The realm of the fairies is perilous because the nature of the fairies themselves is unpredictable. Sometimes they are friendly, sometimes hostile, sometimes helpful, sometimes deceitful, sometimes good, but often mischievous, and sometimes downright wicked, often generous, but always quick to anger. By fairies, I mean all kinds of magical beings who can take a human or semi-human form, whether they are the winged fairies of the air, the solitary fairies such as the household hob or the leprechaun, the underground dwellers such as dwarfs and gnomes, the freshwater fairies such as kelpies, or the saltwater fairies such as mermaids and selkies. The fairy folk are as diverse as we are, and range from majestic elves to malevolent trolls. The origin of the fairies is explained in various ways. Sometimes they are thought of as a separate race of beings, the people of peace, who have always existed alongside human beings. Sometimes they are said to have been an earlier race of beings who have been supplanted by humans. Sometimes they are said to have be the souls of the dead who are neither good enough for heaven nor wicked enough for hell. In Ireland and Scotland, fairies are often believed to be angels who were cast out of heaven after the rebellion of Lucifer. When God shut the doors of heaven and hell, all those who were in either place remained, but many were caught between, still falling through the air. Some fell on the land and some on the sea, and wherever they landed, they became the fairy folk. In Scandinavia, the fairies are called the hidden people, and they are believed to be descended from the children whom Eve hid from God, as this Icelandic story tells. The origins of the Elves. Once, God Almighty visited Adam and Eve. They were glad to see him and made him welcome. They showed him around their house, which was sparkling clean, and he admired the children whom they called in to meet him. "What fine children," God said. "Do you have any more?" "No," said Eve, but that was a lie. The truth was that Eve had had a number of other children, but they had not been washed, and she did not want God to see them when they were dirty. When she saw God coming, she had pushed them out of sight and told them to stay hidden. God knew this and said, "That which has been hidden from me shall be hidden from all." So the children Eve conceived from God became the elves, who live in the woods and on the open moors, and in rocks and hills and caves, while the children she showed to God became the human beings. Elves are invisible to human beings unless they wish to be seen. They are the hidden people. Some human beings encounter the hidden people by accident, and others are sought out by them because the hidden people need their help. Still others, such as the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, go looking for them on purpose. Yeats was fascinated by the supernatural, by magic and astrology and visions. He particularly loved the idea of fairies. Nations of gay creatures having no souls, nothing in their bright bodies but a mouthful of sweet air. Yeats asked old Irish peasants about the fairies and found that they had accepted them as part of their natural world. One old Galway countryman, renowned as a seer and healer, told Yeats, "I see them in all places, and there's no man mowing a meadow that doesn't see them at one time or another." End quote. More than anything else, Yeats longed to see a fairy for himself, and on October 14th, 1892, he did. The Poet and the Fairy Queen. Yeats went walking along the sandy shore at Ross's Point in County Sligo in northwestern Ireland. With him were his uncle, a middle-aged man, and his cousin, a young woman who, like Yeats himself, saw visions and who was said to have once narrowly escaped being made captive of the fairies. They stopped at a cave that was a haunt of fairies, the forgetful people. Yeats made a circle in the sand and invoked the fairies. Soon his uncle heard voices like boys shouting and the sound of distant music. His cousin saw a bright light and heard music, talking, and the sound of cheering and stamping feet, all coming from the heart of the rock. Then she saw them, a host of little people dressed in red, dancing to a tune she did not know. Yeats summoned the queen of the fairies to come to him, and she did. She was not small, but had the appearance of a beautiful tall woman with gold ornaments and dark hair. When she asked, she called the fairies out of the cave and drew them up in 4 bands. One band carried boughs of mountain ash in their hands, another wore necklaces made of serpent scales. Yeats questioned the fairy queen closely, but often she did not understand what he wanted to know. When he asked her if fairies were not dramatizations of our moods, she answered that her people were much like human beings and do most of the things human beings do. In the end, the practical fairy queen lost patience with the airy fairy poet. She wrote in the sand, "Be careful and do not seek to know too much about us." Then she vanished, and the poet, his uncle, and his cousin were left alone on the shore, shivering as a cold wind blew in from the sea. The fairy queen's instructions to Yeats not to seek to know too much echoes the traditional belief that it was unlucky to meddle in the affairs of fairies or to talk loosely or disrespectfully about them. As one old woman told Yeats, "I always mind my own affairs, and they always mind theirs." One man who did not seek to know too much was the Scottish minister Robert Kirk. Kirk was born in 1644 and was a seventh son, and so had the power of second sight. He was fascinated by the fairies and wrote the first known book about them, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, in which he concluded that fairies are of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, with bodies of congealed air. Kirk knew all kinds of things about the fairies, even that they believe that nothing perisheth, but as the sun and year, everything goes in a circle, lesser or greater, and is renewed and refreshed in its revolutions. He is supposed to have paid a great price for his curiosity. The Secret Commonwealth. Shortly after he completed the manuscript of his book, the Reverend Robert Kirk took a walk in the evening air. He was only wearing a nightshirt. When he did not come home, the rest of his household searched for him and found his lifeless body lying on top of a fairy hill, one of those fairy dwellings with which Kirk himself records that it is impious and dangerous to meddle. The body was carried home and buried the next day in the minister's own churchyard. But later, Robert Kirk appeared to one of his relatives and gave him a message for his cousin, Graham of Doutray. Kirk said that he was not dead, he was a captive in fairyland. His wife was expecting a child when he died, and Kirk promised that he would appear again at the child's christening. When he did so, Graham was to throw a knife over Kirk's head, and this would free him from the fairies' power, as their enchantments can be broken with cold iron. At the christening, as all the family sat down to celebrate, the wreath of Robert Kirk appeared among them. But Graham of Doutray was so startled that he forgot to throw his knife. The moment passed, the apparition faded away, and Robert Kirk was never seen again. And in the parish of Aberfoyle, they will show to you to this day the fairy hill where he dwells, a captive of the fairies, about whom he asked one question too many. Not all fairies live beneath fairy hills. Some live in rocks or caves or in wells, pools, or streams. Others share the homes of human beings, whether farmhouse or castle. There are also fairies of wild places such as Scandinavian wood elves. One Norwegian woodcutter told how he saw one of these wood elves with his own eyes. She was one of the fairies whose glamour only works from the front. If you see her from behind, you realize she is completely hollow. When one of these fairies tries to entice a man into her power, he must keep his wits about him and ask her to turn around, and then the spell will be broken. In my young days, he said, I saw the wood fairy with my own eyes. She had a red knitted jacket, a green bodice, and blue gown. She ran past me with her long, yellow, flowing hair flying loose about her. Here she was pretty in the face, but behind she was as hollow as a baking trough. Fairies are often also associated with flowers. The Folklore of Cornwall in England's Celtic southwest tells of the beautiful flowering gardens of the Cornish fairies. On the Lizard Peninsula at the very western tip of Cornwall, near to Land's End, is a finely balanced stone called Logan Rock. This is a fairy place, and before it was tipped from its balance by Lieutenant Goldsmith on April 8, 1824, sick infants who were rocked on it could be magically cured. Although the rock was set back in place, the charm was broken. On the southwest side of Logan Rock Where the cliffs run down to the sea are the gardens of the small folk, beautiful green spots on the rock where feathery ferns and delicate cliff pinks grow. The fairies who tend these gardens are beautiful creatures who love to do good, but they do not like it when human beings meddle with them, and they get angry if someone they have helped brags about it. Though by day you can see no flowers in their gardens save the pinks, by the midsummer moonlight the gardens blossom with flowers of every color, more beautiful than any mortal garden. One Cornish fisherman described how they looked from the sea. When I have been to a sea close under the cliffs of a fine summer's night, I have heard the sweetest of music and seen hundreds of little lights moving about amongst what looked like flowers. Aye, they were flowers too, for you may smell the sweet scent far out at sea. Indeed, I have heard many of the old men say that they have smelt the sweet perfume and heard the music from the fairy gardens of the castle when more than a mile from shore. Once, when a gang of smugglers were trying to land their contraband goods at Zenor on the Lizard, they disturbed the fairies at their dancing. The little men were all dressed in green, with red caps. When a smuggler began to mock them, the small folk advanced their bows and arrows, spears and slings, looking fierce despite their size. The smuggler shouted, "Put to sea for your lives! There's thousands of small people and bookaboos almost at our backs." The smugglers had to abandon their goods and flee. They were safe on the sea because the fairies could not abide salt water. Music and dance play a huge part in the fairy life, but the fairies also, as the fairy queen told W.B. Yeats, do most of the things human beings do. They hold markets and fairs, and they fall in and out of love. Scottish tradition records a fairy love song. I left in the doorway of the bower my jewel, the dusky brown, white-skinned. Her eye like a star, her lip like a berry, her voice like a stringed instrument. I left yesterday in the meadow of the kine, the brown-haired maid of sweetest kiss. Her eye like a star, her cheek like a rose, her kiss has this taste of pears. It is above all the piercing eye like a star that shows that this is a fairy maiden and not a human girl. Some convinced that fairies are fallen angels say that they can neither have children nor die, but remain always the same, unchanged and unchanging. But tradition tells of fairy children and of fairy funerals. Robert Kirk tells us that they live much longer than we, yet die at last. The poet William Blake was one of the few people who can claim to have seen a fairy funeral. In his garden, he said he saw a procession of creatures of the size and color of green and gray grasshoppers, bearing a body laid out on a rose leaf, which they buried with songs and then disappeared. The funeral of the fairy queen. One moonlit night, a fisherman named Richard was returning home to Lelant in Cornwall. As he climbed the hill from St. Ives, he thought he heard the bell of Lelant church tolling, and saw lights flickering in the windows. The bell was not clear and bright as usual, but muffled. Curious, Richard walked up to the church and peered in through the window. At first he could see nothing, but then he saw a funeral procession. The central aisle was crowded with little people who were wearing wreaths of wild roses and carrying bows of blossoming myrtle. 6 of them were bearing a little coffin, and inside the coffin was a body the size of a child's doll. The body was that of a beautiful woman, as lovely as an angel. It was covered in white flowers, and its golden hair was tangled among the blossoms. Richard watched as a party of men with picks and spades dug a grave before the altar, and then lowered the coffin down into the hole. As they did so, they tore off their wreaths and broke their myrtle branches, crying, "Our queen is dead, our queen is dead." When the grave was filled, the fairies began to wail and shriek, and Richard was so alarmed that he cried out too. The lights went out and the fairies flew off. As they passed Richard, he felt the pinpricks as they thrust at him with tiny swords, and he fled for his life. For centuries, it has been said that the fairies are dwindling and departing, chased away by noise and confusion of we humans. One tradition records the final departure of the Scottish fairies. The departure of the fairies. On Sunday morning in the little hamlet of Burn Ithie, all the people had gone to church, save one herdsboy and his sister, who were lounging beside one of the cottages. Just as the shadow on the sundial touched noon, they saw a long cavalcade winding its way out of the woods and into the village. The horses were shaggy little things, speckled dun and gray. The riders were stunted, ugly creatures dressed in old-fashioned plaid jerkins, long gray cloaks, and little red caps. Their long hair was wild and uncombed. The boy and his sister stood gazing in astonishment and dismay as rider after rider passed the cottage and disappeared into the brushwood on the hillside. At last, only one rider, who was lagging behind the others, was left. The boy plucked up his courage and said, "What are you, little Manny?" "Not of the race of Adam," said the creature. "Where are you going?" asked the boy. And then the little man turned in his saddle, looked the boy in the eye, and told him, "The people of peace shall never more be seen in Scotland." And so ends the beginning of The Little People. And we have just covered chapter 1, The World of the Fairies. And next time we'll do Fairy Folk out of this book. And I hope you enjoyed the reading tonight. And thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all soon. If you have any questions or answers or anything else, please get in touch with me. I appreciate that so much. And many blessings to you. Much magic in your life. And thank you so much for tuning in and subscribing and sharing and liking these videos. It means so much to me. And it helps me keep going and lets me know what I should make more of also. I appreciate that so much. There's so much inspirational content on YouTube. I'm just happy to be somebody who has the opportunity to be on here with everyone also. It makes me so happy. All right, I will close up now, and thank you so much for viewing this. Take care.